Grüß Gott, hallo, ja, Polingena, g'day. My name's Billy Badger and I'm coming to you today again from Nipoluna, Hobart, the lands of the Hum310 people, right here in Lutruwita, Tasmania. Now last week we asked the question, do we even really need translation? And we quickly introduced some different kinds of translation. Well, this week we're asking the questions, what is translation? How do we do it? What do we expect of it? Let's find out. So what is translation? We saw in the last lecture that there are lots of different kinds of translation that involve some kind of transformation, some kind of change from one format into another. So if you stick with me here, I'll give you an analogy that explains how I see translation. So translation is like what we do when we use electricity. We start with something that has some kind of energy, like water rushing downhill, wind, the sun, that sort of thing, yeah? But in the case of water, it's got energy, but it's just not in a form that will help us see in the dark unless we convert it. This is, of course, hydroelectricity. But it's not 100% efficient. Some of this energy gets lost. In the case of our light bulb, it creates light, but it also gets hot. So some of the original energy from that water gets lost. And that, I'd argue, is what happens when we translate. We take information from where it exists in one form, work out how to transform it into another form that looks and sounds different, but it's in a form that we can use. But of course, this is just the way I see it. Now, I asked my colleagues the same question, and this is some of what they said.
What is translation?
What is translation?
What is translation? Well, for me, the nature of translation depends on what it is that I'm translating.
Translating is converting the content from one language to another language without changing the meaning.
Translation to me is all about building a clearer picture of what was really happening.
Translation means to carry across meaning.
Carrying ideas, meanings.
For me, translation is a tool for us to both limit and expand our understanding of the world.
Translation is an effort to get messages across in communication.
You do not need two languages in order to translate. You can translate with gestures and within one language.
So what is translation? I like to think of translation in terms of three modes: text-based, communication-based, and adaptation-based.
So in all of these cases, it's really about thinking about how a mind which worked in a very different context would have expressed itself if it had chosen to speak English instead.
You'll see full versions at the end of this video. All right, so what is translation? Before even trying to work out what we mean by translation or what it is, what it involves, it's perhaps pretty useful to start by looking at where the word come from originally, because this sets the scene for a lot of what we're going to be talking about in this unit. Now, originally, of course, translation as a word wasn't an English word. It comes from Latin and consists more or less of two bits. First of all, there's the preposition trans, which indicates a kind of movement across, which I guess makes sense if you think about some of the other words that start with trans, like transmit, transfer, transport, and so on. And then there's the latus, a form of the Latin verb to carry or to bear. And oddly, for those of us who don't know much Latin, the word latus is a special form of the verb fero. And so there is actually a very close link between the words translate and transfer. Either way, what the word was originally trying to communicate was the idea of something being carried across, which is what we mean when we say transport. And so it seems that it's a sensible word to use if we're talking about trying to translate between languages, where we try to get, or even if you like, carry the original idea phrased in one language across to somebody who speaks a different language. But it's also a sensible word to use for pretty much any kind of communication, if you think about it, regardless of whether we're speaking different languages or not, since communication is really all about getting ideas across. So I want to suggest to you again that all communication involves translation. In his book After Babel, George Steiner tells us any model of communication is at the same time a model of translation. And Matthew Reynolds tells us much the same thing, but views translation as a part of communication. Okay, so let's turn to translation. Now, look, I've often said that translation always involves some kind of compromise. And if this is the case, what decisions guide us when we translate? How do we translate? How do we decide which of those compromises are okay? Do we have our limits, things that we won't compromise on? To start off, I want to briefly mention two competing ideas with regard to translation, because these kind of set the scene for what we're going to be thinking about. Put simply, it involves the question, if we're reading something that has been translated, should it be obvious to us that it has been translated? In the terms of translation theory, we're really asking the questions, should the translation be domesticating or foreignizing? Should it be transparent or should it appear foreign? I think at this stage it's probably worth introducing a character from the past whose ideas about translation have been quite influential. And this character is Friedrich Schleiermacher, a German philosopher who wrote in 1813 on the different methods of translation. Now, he was writing in German, so the following quote is itself, of course, a translation. Anyway, Schleiermacher argued that either the translator leaves the author in peace as much as possible and moves the reader towards him, or he leaves the reader in peace as much as possible and moves the author towards him. So the translator needs to choose between what's been called a domesticating practice and a foreignizing practice. So we've got people like Norman Shapiro who say, I see translation as the attempt to produce a text so transparent that it does not seem to be translated. A good translation is like a pane of glass. You only notice that it's there when there are little imperfections, scratches and bubbles. Ideally, there shouldn't be any. It should never call attention to itself. And then, of course, there is the foreignizing translation where, as we read in this rather fancier description, the translator intentionally disrupts the linguistic and genre expectations of the target language in order to mark the otherness of the translated texts. So before we move on, what do you think? What should a translation be? Should it be transparent? Should you not even notice it? Or should it be obvious? Or maybe somewhere in between? Either way, it's going to be a compromise, isn't it? Are we able to substitute one word for another, one idea for another, one sign for another? Would two different translators come up with the same translation? And if the answer is no, then what does this tell us about the precision or the potential of translations? If each person translates any one text differently, even just slightly, can we be sure the original message is being translated accurately? I think the best place to start is with an example, and I want to look at the very specific situation of translating poetry. Now, ordinarily, this is probably not something that we would want to do, certainly not voluntarily. But I want to do this not because poetry is awesome, and it kind of is, but because translating poetry raises a lot of questions that are fundamental to translations of any kind. And of course, with poetry, I'm thinking about the peculiar rhyme and rhythm of poetry that needs to be reproduced in translation. Or does it? Let's start off with something fairly random here, a medieval German love poem, one that starts with these lines. Du bist mein, ich bin dein, des sollt du gewiss sein. Now, since most of us don't understand medieval German, let's set Google Translate to work. Now, there's not a medieval German option, unfortunately, so let's choose just German and hope for the best, and we get this. You are mine, I am dein. That doesn't translate too well. You should be sure of that. So we almost got there. With a little correction, this becomes you are mine, I am yours, you should be sure of that. And if we were to take the second line literally, then it could read, of this you should be certain, because gewiss means certain or sure or something along those lines. So let's look at what we've got. Well, the first line is okay, I guess, but the internal rhyme has gone. Mine and yours don't really rhyme the way mein and dein do in the original. We could attempt a similarly old-sounding variant if we use the English thine instead of yours, which I guess would be more fitting. So we would end up with you are mine, I am thine, but then we're stuck because our next line has to rhyme with this as well. And we can't really find a way of rhyming certain with thine unless we go with one of these. What we might have to do is not translate the words, but translate the meaning. We could end up with something like this, maybe. And it's similar, I guess you could argue. You belong to me, I belong to you. You need to know that this is true. Well, it says much the same thing, doesn't it? And it rhymes, just that internal rhyme in the first line has gone, I guess. Well, what about this then? If we swap the order of the parts of the first line, I am yours, you are mine, you know that that's a good sign. That works, doesn't it? But it doesn't sound like it was ever a medieval German poem. If I read the original, I recognise a sense of history. I can envisage the person who might have written this, quill in hand, accompanied by some medieval lute music, writing to a maiden on horseback. But is this important? Do we need to be able to recognise the origins and the context? Should the translation be transparent, as we've said, or foreign? So from this, here are some questions for us to consider. And in case you're counting, I've got 14 of them. And even though I'm using the example of that medieval poem, we should be able to see that a lot of these ideas apply to any kind of translation. So here we go. If we're translating an old text from medieval German, do we translate it into, say, modern English, or into a form of the language contemporary with the original? Would it need to, for example, be translated into medieval English? If I'm translating Shakespeare into Spanish, does it need to be an older form of Spanish, the sort of Spanish that they would have spoken back in the 16th and 17th centuries? Is it enough to get the general idea across, just so that we know what it's about? Or do we have to be really precise? Does it need to be a similar reading experience in both languages? Then the question, does it need to be word for word? Or can we miss some stuff out? Is that okay? Like maybe some words or elements that are perhaps not 100% necessary in the language of the translation. Okay, next question then. For that matter, can we add stuff in? so that the translation makes better sense in the new language? Is that going to be okay? And then there's the question, if we read the translated text, to what extent should that translation be visible or invisible? And we talked about this earlier. But does it need to read as if it was written in the original language or in the target language? Then there's the question of footnotes. Should we work perhaps with footnotes to explain meaning where this is not 100% obvious? Or what do we do with words and ideas that don't translate all that easily? If you really have to translate the text, what compromises are okay? Which ones are not okay? What do we do about slang and idiomatic expressions? If we read, for example, in the original, he crossed his fingers that she was not just pulling his leg, we need to know whether these are idioms that exist in other languages. In German, a language that I'm familiar with, you wouldn't be crossing your fingers, but you'd be pressing your thumbs, and instead of pulling someone's leg, you'd be taking them on the arm. Is it necessary to retain some of the flavour of the original? Or is it okay to replace fingers with thumbs and legs with arms? What about descriptions of gestures? If in a novel we read that someone made this gesture means you're crazy in German, but few other people would understand that. Or if it's an American novel that talks about flipping someone the bird, if you don't know that one, look it up. Do we need to mention birds in the translation, or can you describe what this person did with that particular finger? Do I, as a translator, this is my next point, do I, as a translator of novels, have to be at least as good a writer as the original author, or is that not necessary? Is translation a science or an art? And then, what do we do about regional variations? If I'm translating the words in a regional dialect, should this dialect be visible in the translated text? How do we do this? Do we need to find a similar dialect in the target language? Translating a text written in, say, New Zealand English or maybe Scottish English that have some peculiarities. Do we need to be able to tell that it was written in a certain form of English? And then how do we do that if we're translating it into Mandarin or Cantonese? If we translate a common, let's take a common Scottish phrase.
As I was thinking about what I was going to do today, I kept thinking, I dinna ken. I dinna ken. That's a great phrase. I use it all the time.
I dinna ken as the equivalent of I don't know, then is not something of that original flavour lost? What do we do, for example, with Australian institutions such as milk bars? These are called dairies in New Zealand. If there aren't any milk bars in other countries, can you leave it as the English word? But would it make any sense to people who think of something else when they hear the word bar or the word dairy, for that matter? And then the question, should we even be translating the poem? Is translation good or bad? This might seem like an obvious question, but as we read in Juliana House's book on translation, over the centuries, translation has been regarded both positively and negatively. Positively because translation can provide access to new ideas and new experiences that stem from a different language community, opening horizons that would otherwise remain unknown behind the barrier of another language. And negatively, because translated texts can never be the real thing. They remain something second-hand, a kind of inferior substitute for the original. And finally, how do we decide who should do the translation? Does it matter? What are the deciding criteria, however? What if we wanted to translate the poem of a young black writer like Amanda Gorman?
With purpose, to compose a country committed to all cultures, colors, characters, and conditions of man. And so we lift our gazes not to what stands between us, but what stands before us. We close the divide because we know to put
Amanda
our future
Gorman
first.
spoke
We must
a
first
poem
put our differences
at Joe
aside.
Biden's inauguration in 2021, and we want to translate it into Dutch. Who do we get to do it? Do you need somebody who's Dutch, maybe American, young, female, black? Who should be allowed to do the translation? Does it matter? Well, originally the publishers and Gorman herself chose the young Booker Prize winning Dutch author Marika Lucas to do the translation. Lucas, white, non-binary author, said they understood the need to retain the strength, tone and style of the original. But Marika Lucas is not, as critics angrily pointed out, a spoken word artist, young, female and unapologetically black. Does the translator need to be from the same racial background, the same culture, the same heritage, experience, gender and status? After all, translation has long been a tool for domination in colonisation. Here we can think of the experience of our own Indigenous population. And for every question, there is of course more than one answer. These are some of the things that we're going to be thinking about in our next tutorial and in the course of the next few weeks. But I'd say the only thing that we know for sure is that translation is something that happens and is always happening. It's an everyday art. As always, there are some further resources in Milo for you to work through in preparation for our tutorial. Make sure you look at these closely before the tut so we can make the most of our time together. Also das war's, that was it. I hope you have a great week. Ich wünsche Ihnen eine schöne Woche. Bis zum nächsten Mal. See you next time. Tschüss. Das war's.